This is your Ontario Budget Special. Good afternoon, I'm Ramraj Sharvendran. We are live across the province this hour as we bring you in-depth analysis on the Ontario budget. In a moment, Finance Minister Peter Bethlenfalvy will deliver Ontario's 2025 budget. We're going to take you to Queen's Park for the beginning of that address. But while we wait for him to begin, let's bring in my co-host this hour, CBC Senior Queen's Park reporter Mike Crawley. Hello, Mike. Okay, so let's rewind a couple of months. U.S. President Donald Trump returned to the White House in January. He upended the relationship between our two countries. And just over a month later, Doug Ford's Progressive Conservatives win a third consecutive majority, largely on the strength of Ford's promise, to fight Trump's tariffs. Mike, given that context, fresh off a provincial election campaign, what sort of budget can we expect to see this hour?
I think that context is what this budget is really got to be all about. I mean, I think all of Ontario is expecting both for the Ford government to follow up on the things that they promised to do in that election campaign that they won. Feels like it was a long time ago, but it was only just back in February. As well, specifically, what is it that they're going to do about tariffs? So, the government made certain promises during the election campaign of the measures that they would bring in. Some of them have actually been announced already ahead of budget day, but we're still looking to see whether they're going to make good on others. And really, Ramraj, it's the fundamental question that everybody's kind of asking is, what is the province going to do about our export-oriented economy and how vulnerable it is to those U.S. tariffs?
Already.
Yeah, so the biggest one in terms of dollar value is a $9 billion deferral of business taxes. So basically any business, corporation that pays taxes to the provincial government has 6 months basically until
Mike, I'm just going to jump in.
2025 to pay that.
It looks as though the finance minister is ready to deliver this budget. Let's go to Queen's Park now and listen in.
Today, Ontario and Canada face challenges unlike anything we have ever faced before. Our closest ally and trading partner, our neighbor, the United States, has overturned an economic relationship we once saw as unshakable. Madam Speaker, I lived in the United States for 15 years. My wife is American. My children were raised there. I remember those days fondly. And working for a Canadian financial institution, I also served as the president of the Canadian Association of New York. And Madam Speaker, when the tragedy of 9/11 occurred, the Canadian Association of New York rallied to support our American friends by hosting a massive Canada Loves New York campaign. Thousands of Canadians flocked to New York to show their support. Madam Speaker, I know Americans would do the same for us. We are not only friends, but we are family. And that is why this trade war hurts. But as families go through bumps, we too will go through these bumps and come out stronger. My father, arriving in Canada in 1951 as a refugee, chose this country. He came to Canada with nothing, and Canada gave him everything. So I dedicate this speech to him and the 41 million others who call this land of ours home. Madam Speaker, I would like to also congratulate you for being the first woman Speaker of Ontario since Confederation. Yeah. And before I begin, I would like to paint a brief picture of the time and place our province finds itself. First and foremost, we need to face the facts. Ontario and all of Canada are at a precipice, and we need to take serious steps to make sure we do not find ourselves anywhere near the bottom. These tariffs, imposed by the United States, have been a wake-up call for Canadians. Ces tarifs imposés par les États-Unis ont été une
These tariffs imposed by the United States have been a wake-up call for Canadians.
Economy and as a nation. Un avertissement qui met en évidence les défis sous-jacents.
A wake-up call that highlights the underlying issues we face an economy and as a nation.
Fear of tariffs and uncertainty, mais ce n'est pas le moment de craindre les tarifs et l'incertitude.
But now is not the time to fear the tariffs and uncertainty.
Growth in our real GDP and growth in our wages with bigger paychecks. We need to achieve this reality because future generations depend on it. And we need to leverage every tool at our disposal to make that happen. Whether it is our competitive advantage in critical minerals, in energy, technology, talent, and our workers, or any other area, we will need to bolster our economy by investing in our powerful and promising industries, by building more, by building faster, and by protecting jobs and creators. And by doing so, we achieve long-term prosperity. After all, a strong economy provides the necessary revenues to invest in education, housing, and healthcare. And so the next question is, how? How will Ontario stand to face the challenges before us and deliver the economy that our future depends on? Madam Speaker, I come here before you today with a proposal, a plan. Au nom du Premier ministre Doug Ford et tout notre gouvernement.
On behalf of the Premier and of all the government of Ontario, today I would like to introduce the Budget 2025 plan in order to protect Ontario.
And our entire government of Ontario, it is my honor today to present to you the 2025 Ontario Provincial Budget, a plan to protect Ontario.
That is Finance Minister Peter Bethlenfalvy. He is delivering Ontario's 2025 budget. And if you're not familiar with how this works, here's a quick reminder. There are people who have had this budget document for several hours now. That includes MPPs, provincial stakeholders, and members of the media. And that includes my co-host today, Mike Crawley. Mike, we had to be a bit cagey moments ago because you couldn't reveal any budget details until now. Now that the embargo is lifted and you're allowed to share, what sticks out to you in this document?
Okay, so Ramraj, for those of us who were, the listeners who were, pardon me, for the people who are watching on our streaming channel, I've got a copy of the budget that I'm waving here, and for those of you who are listening on the radio in your car, I'm waving a copy of the budget. It's called A Plan to Protect Ontario. It's got an image of the Ontario flag against kind of a cloudy sky with a little bit of sun poking through. There's an interesting contrast in tone to the minister's speech and the words in this budget and the numbers in this budget. In fact, it's a pretty grim picture inside this budget. His speech is full of lots of rousing rhetoric. He talks about, revolutionary changes to the Ontario economy. But I got to say, the numbers in this budget are fairly tough reading. It's a forecast for the economy that suggests government revenues are going to be tightened because of what's happening in the way of economic growth. So they're forecasting 0.8% economic growth in the coming year. They're forecasting that unemployment is going to stay at 7% or higher, not just this year, but also next year. They're forecasting corporate profits to go down, and so that means less corporate tax revenue coming into the province. And so that's on the revenue side. On the spending side, relatively speaking, you don't see cuts in here, but there's some money that actually isn't even accounted for. So let me tell you first about the biggest single tariff fighting fund that is in the budget. It's $5 billion, and that is called the Protecting Ontario account. And if you think of it, it's basically some money that the government says they will make available down the road to businesses that are affected by tariffs. But the numbers aren't actually on the books yet. So when I tell you that the deficit is $14.6 billion, that doesn't include a penny of spending that potentially up to $5 billion supporting businesses against tariffs. So, yeah, a relatively grim picture, Ramraj.
I know during last year's budget, the province promised a balanced budget by 2026. How does that impact Ontario's overall financial outlook based on what we're seeing today?
Yeah, so there's a 1-year delay in what they call the path to balance. So now the forecast is another deficit budget next year, and then getting back to balance in the fiscal 2027-28. So that's a year later than they were talking about, even just last fall when the finance minister tabled his sort of mid-year financial update.
Now, it often takes a bit of time to figure out where the cuts are coming from. I know you mentioned it's not clear right now, but do we have any sense of where spending is down in some sectors?
Yeah, so there's definitely a decrease in the spending within the post-secondary sector, and so that's as a result of revenues going down in for colleges. So it's seen as decreased spending, but it's actually less money coming into the colleges because the colleges are on the province's books. And so the spending is definitely down within the education sector, mainly as a result of so much less revenue coming into the colleges from the international students who would used to in the past pay significantly higher tuition. Those numbers are coming down. So that's one thing that is that's definitely squeezed. Healthcare spending is almost flatline if you compare this year to what it looks like the government spent last year. And follow along with me here. What they had projected they were going to spend in healthcare last year, when they tabled the budget last year. This year's budget's actually up a bit, up significantly, but what actually happened last year, the actual spending that they did in healthcare went up. And so it now looks like there's actually not an increase in healthcare spending. So that's going to be interesting because there's still been population growth and increasing demand on the healthcare sector.
All right, Mike, I want to bring somebody in who's been listening into this conversation, who's going to be with us this hour. Brian Lewis is a senior fellow at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. He is also former chief economist for the province. Hello, Brian.
Hello, good to be here.
I saw you nodding along to some things that Mike was saying there. What were some of your takeaways from this budget?
Yeah, just to highlight a few things that I think would align with what Mike was talking about. It's from an economist perspective, it's a pretty sobering document. Very weak growth in real gross domestic product the next couple of years. It's appropriate, because given the economic circumstances we in, it's just an appropriate basis for budgeting. It's just unfortunate that this is where we're at. Further than that, there's a wide range of views around the economy, even for this year. On one end of the range, Scotiabank thinks real GDP will grow 1.6%, which is sort of a picture of an economy that kind of just shuffles forward for the rest of the year. Bank of Montreal at the other end of the spectrum is calling for a 0.2% decline in real GDP this year, which, when you do the math, is suggesting a pretty moderate-sized recession this year. So not only is the overall picture fairly sobering, there's a really, really broad range of risk around it that the government does have a good narrative around and has alternative scenarios to discuss how things might play out. But I think we have to keep that in mind. The budget's a reasonable set of numbers, but things could be better and they could be worse.
I mean, the province's news release claims that Ontario's finances are in the strongest position they've been in over a decade. How would you assess that statement?
Yeah, I think that's largely based on the fact that our debt to GDP ratio going into this was the lowest it's been in about a decade. So it's got a factual basis, and it's supported by the fact that a couple of bond rating agencies recently have upgraded the province's credit rating. So we are going into this in relatively good shape, and even with the fiscal plan, that's based on the current economic outlook, the debt to GDP ratio. No, first of all, debt goes up a lot. The debt to GDP ratio edges up, but we don't get over the 40% line that the province considers the sustainable range, which is good. I guess I'd say two other things on the government's finances before I forget to mention them. One is, to get back to balance, there's a pretty heavy degree of expenditure restraint implied in this. Program spending's only growing less than 1% per year on average over the next 3 years. Given the rates of inflation and population growth, that's going to be tough to do. It means restraint in real terms. Even if you're not really cutting budget lines, you're going to have to find savings to just keep caught up with cost pressures and population. So That's pretty tough. And for context, this is actually pretty good compared to other provinces. Our deficit as a percentage of GDP is a little bit higher than Alberta's, but way lower than Quebec and BC. So if you look at us compared to other big provinces, we actually line up pretty good. So just a couple things I thought were kind of interesting.
Now, the province is cutting the gas tax, ending tolls on a portion of the 407, and taxes are being deferred for businesses affected by tariffs. And we've seen a big drop in LCBO revenue. How is that all affecting the way the province can make revenue?
Yeah, well, the government's very much in favor of keeping affordability down, and that comes with a revenue price tag associated with it. I think it was in the fall economic statement they tabulated all the savings to households and businesses, and I believe the household savings were about $12 billion. So that's good for households. They're spending less money on a wide range of fees and taxes and things like that. But it does come at the cost to the government purse, and the government's continuing to spend a lot of money on affordability measures, like over $7 billion to keep electricity a little bit less expensive for people. So it's been a very big, sort of plank of the Ford government to try to keep affordability in line for people or try to improve affordability. But we shouldn't forget about the fact that the money has to come from somewhere, and in this case, we've been borrowing it.
Okay, Brian, we're going to come back to you in just a bit. Thank you for your thoughts on that. We want to bring stakeholders into this conversation, the people, sectors, organizations who may benefit from this budget or be left wanting more. So we're going to first check in on infrastructure, affordability, and the auto sector. But before we get there, the threat of U.S. tariffs and their impact are all over this budget in the priorities. And the tariffs in place are taking a bite out of Ontario's economy. Dennis Darby is the president and CEO of Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters and joins me now. Hello, Dennis. Looks like we're having a bit of trouble hearing you, Dennis. I can see that you can hear me. We're just going to try to sort that out. Dennis, are you there?
Ramaj, thank you very much for your patience.
No, thank you for joining us. Now, the majority of tariff response measures in today's budget had already been announced. We're talking about, opportunities for businesses to defer taxes, like I mentioned, employer rebates through WSIB, and $40 million for new trade-impacted communities program. How far do those programs go in addressing the impact of tariffs on manufacturers and exporters in the province?
Well, given the existential threat of tariffs, and given so much of Ontario's economy is based upon trade with the U.S., and regrettably the tariffs that are there on automobiles and steel and aluminum products affect Ontario disproportionately. That is a big help. The other part, the increase in the Ontario-made tax credit from 10 to 15%, that helps companies retool, helps them make those investments, because one of the things we've been seeing since President Trump was elected was we've seen a complete drop in any investment, and this is a way to try to get companies, help manufacturers invest in that tooling so they can be competitive. So I think that's one other piece that will help.
Okay, and this budget anticipates layoffs, even referencing mass layoffs at one point in the document. The province is promising $20 million to launch new training and support centers for those laid off employees. Is that going to make a dent in this?
It will certainly make a dent, and they've talked about adding $1 billion to help skills development fund for industry and money for STEM training. One of the issues we are going to have as we hopefully come through this tariff situation over the next maybe year or two. I don't want to try to predict, none of us can, what the U.S. will do, but let me tell you that we will need people with those right skills, and we need to make sure, yes, even with some layoffs, hopefully temporary layoffs coming, we will need people with the right technical skills to be able to install, maintain, run, and fix the equipment that we'll need to adopt in order to be competitive. So those technical skills, those STEM trades, there is a commitment to putting more money into that to help improve that, because that's, as you said, reskilling those workers to be able to take on the new technology is going to be critical for Ontario if we're going to continue to have such a strong manufacturing sector.
Right, and one of the other solutions being explored, just yesterday we saw Premier Doug Ford and Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew agree to ease economic barriers between the two provinces. This continues on the conversation of international or interprovincial trade. How important is that interprovincial trade and removing those barriers in addressing this tariff threat?
So the most important part for the manufacturing sector is the movement of skilled workers and having qualifications recognized. So workers can move from province to province, from a truck driver to a welder to a millwright, and also trying to remove those barriers. I know it may be hard to believe, but there are differences in how the trucks have to be outfitted between province to province. So all of those sort of non-tariff, small, but often costly issues, those are the things we have to tear down between provinces, and that was a good start yesterday.
How much further would you like to see the province going? Like, what is it that you're left wanting more here?
Well, first of all, I think they're absolutely on the right track in putting money in place to reskill workers to be able to help businesses get through the tariff wars. I think we'll need to look at the details to see how these are going to be applied, because of course the devil's off in the details. But anything that helps manufacturers weather this storm, and I believe it is a storm with the U.S., it's going to ultimately relieve. But you don't want to have a situation which we feared at the beginning of the Trump tariffs, that it would have a complete wholesale change to the manufacturing. What we're seeing is companies are trying to hang on. The province has an important role to help them weather this storm, and I think they're on the right track.
All right. I appreciate you joining us this afternoon.
Thank you.
That is Dennis Darby, President and CEO of Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters. You're listening to special coverage of the Ontario budget on CBC Radio 1. We're also streaming on CBC Gem, cbcnews.ca/Toronto, and on your smart TV. Now, let's bring in another stakeholder into this conversation that's just as vulnerable as Ontario's auto sector. It is under pressure from the U.S. and its tariffs on Canadian-made vehicles. Just this week, Honda hit pause on investments and EV manufacturing in Alston. David Adams is the president and CEO of Global Automakers of Canada. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
So let's talk about the Honda announcement this week and their pause on investing in EV. When I spoke to the mayor, Richard Norcross of New Tecumseth, he was confident that investment was still going to come through. The province has doubled down on its EV investments in this budget. What does Honda's move signal about the confidence manufacturers are having in doing business in this province?
Well, I think it's more a statement in terms of the reality of the adoption of electric vehicles by consumers at this point in time. I think we've seen a number of other investors hit the pause on their EV investments, and I truly do believe that that's what this Honda announcement is. It's a pause for 2 years, that the investment will eventually come to fruition. That's certainly been Honda's legacy in Ontario for the 40 years that they've been here. But, the reality is that the environment for electric vehicles has changed, and that's been driven by a few things. It's been driven by economic uncertainty. Consumers don't want to make big purchases when they're concerned about their jobs. We've seen some of the federal and the provincial incentives that would assist consumers in purchasing those vehicles go by the wayside. And the infrastructure hasn't been built out to the extent that consumers would like it to be, to give them the confidence to make that purchase so that they know they can charge their vehicle whenever and wherever they need to.
Now, if you flip through the auto support section of this budget, they talk about spending $85 million over the next few years on its Automotive modernization program and the Vehicle Innovation Network. How much of a change is that going to make for the EV market here?
Well, I think those are two areas where the government focuses its resources to assist in that transition to EVs. I think, the larger commitment that was made, I think, by the government in the budget was the commitment to provide funding to induce more manufacturing investment into the province. So amping that up, if you will, to make the province even more attractive for those considering investing here to do so. But, the reality is that the automotive industry has been the focal point of all of these current economic challenges that have been brought on by the tariff. And I think the budget sort of strikes a decent balance between providing workers with some assurance that they'll be taken care of through some of the measures in the budget, also putting in some skills training initiatives to assist us in getting reskilled for that electric vehicle future, and also helping workers that may have to transition out of an existing job into a new one. And then also just providing some support there to workers as well. So I think it strikes the right balance. It can't all be about support. We need to keep our eye on bringing in new investment into the province and moving forward.
But is it enough? I mean, Trump's rhetoric is he doesn't want cars made in Canada. He wants to bring those jobs back into the U.S. Is this all being done in vain, or is there a bigger shift that needs to happen here?
Well, no, I don't think it's all being done in vain because I think, I sort of really don't like admitting it, but I think one of the good things that came out of President Trump's actions is it focused the attention of Canada on Canada's auto industry and its importance. If we lose our auto manufacturing sector, we lose our parts sector, and we lose a significant contribution to our overall GDP, somewhere in the neighborhood of 15% of our GDP. So it's really important that we retain that sector, and I think some of these initiatives are designed to ensure that that's the case moving forward.
Doug Ford this week promised to hold automakers accountable, especially after the questions rose with Honda's pause on what was looking like a $15 billion investment. What are they going to need to do to hold these automakers accountable?
Well, I think some of the things that they have started to do, which is in response to the U.S. tariffs, retaliatory tariffs have been imposed, and there's a remission process put in place, but that's basically on the basis of what you're building here in Canada. So it's almost like we are going back to sort of the mid-1960s before the Auto Pact, and even when we had the Auto Pact, I guess, where the basic premise of that was if you want to sell vehicles in this country, then you need to build them in this country. So, obviously our goal is to try and ensure that working with the United States and Mexico, we continue to have that North American free trade area, the USMCA area. But if that's not a certainty, then provincial government, federal government, Ontario especially, they need to look at alternatives.
David, I appreciate your time this afternoon.
Thanks for having me.
David Adams is the president and CEO of the Global Automakers of Canada. If you're just tuning in, I'm Ramraj Sharvendran. You are listening to a province-wide budget special here on Radio 1, but also streaming on your smart TV and on CBC Gem and many other places. I want to bring in my co-host this afternoon, CBC Queen's Park reporter, senior Queen's Park reporter, Mike Crawley. Mike, we heard from the manufacturer's voice, automakers' voices here. There seems to be a bit of optimism in what they're saying and what they're seeing in the budget. What do you make of how they're taking these numbers?
Yeah, what's interesting about that, Ramraj, is that for those sectors, there isn't sort of actual specific aid yet. There's these large funds that are earmarked to help in the event of the tariff starting to have an impact. But when I actually look at what's in the budget in the way of new funding for certain sectors, there's actually a lot for mining. There's a new $500 million processing fund for critical minerals, which we've heard a lot about. Those are in large part potential to mine in Northern Ontario to go into EV batteries. There's also a $3 billion fund that they're calling the Indigenous Opportunities Financing Program, and so that is an expansion to support Indigenous participation in sectors like electricity, also in critical minerals and resource development. So no real targeted funding there to help out the auto sector specifically, or the manufacturing sector specifically. The other thing to note too is that when it comes to direct support for individual workers, it seems like the plan of the province is going to be kind of similar to what went on in COVID, that it's up to the feds to deliver the direct support to laid off workers, and the province is there to deliver support to industry sectors to help businesses do their best to remain functioning. And there was some mention too earlier in the conversation about interprovincial trade that I thought was interesting, because as much as a lot of economic sectors are really keen on there being movement to get rid of interprovincial trade barriers, there's also a school of thought that to some extent the potential benefit there is overstated, right? It's a motherhood and apple pie thing. Yes, let's get rid of interprovincial trade barriers, but if you think about it, that U.S. market, 10 times the size of Canada, even if Ontario had unfettered access to all markets across Canada, it's nowhere near replacing the size of that U.S. market.
All right, Mike, I want to remind folks what they're listening to. If you're just tuning in, I'm Ramraj Sharvendran. That is CBC Senior Queen's Park reporter Mike Crawley, my co-host this hour, as we put some analysis on the Ontario budget that is being unveiled this hour. You're listening on CBC Radio 1 and streaming on your smart TV, CBC Gem, or cbcnews.ca/Toronto. Thank you for joining us. We're going to bring you some analysis from a mayoral perspective. Now, tariffs are expected to impact some communities much more than others, and the Canadian Chamber of Commerce has put out a list of places most vulnerable to tariffs. Windsor made the list, along with Hamilton, Guelph, Brantford, and Kitchener-Waterloo. Joining me right now is the Mayor of Waterloo, Dorothy McCabe. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Ramraj. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us. The province is promising $40 million program for communities like yours that could be impacted by trade. So how far is that going to go in your community?
Well, I mean, it's tough to say because, we haven't seen the full impacts of the tariffs yet. And we do know in our Waterloo region, we're heavily invested in the automotive sector. So, I mean, if $40 million is for across the province, I would say, it may be early days to really know how much is going to be needed and where it's going to be needed. But at this point, when there still is so much uncertainty, it's good to have that. I hope maybe we could say it's a good good start.
And what kind of impact are you expecting tariffs to have on your community then?
Well, it's interesting that our community it's a community of about 700,000 across Kitchener, Waterloo, and Cambridge, plus our townships, and it is impacting our communities differently. Waterloo is where I'm the mayor of is more heavily skewed towards high tech. Sorry, my phone is ringing. Is more skewed to high tech, artificial intelligence, and our post-secondary, and so we're seeing that companies there that I've talked to are figuring workarounds, and they're finding new suppliers, and in some cases they're busier than ever. But in Kitchener and Cambridge, we know that they're much more heavily invested in Tier 3 and automotive supply companies, as well as Toyota. So we do expect a pretty heavy impact on those communities. But right now, with some of them still paused for 90 days, there's still a lot of question marks out there. But I can say we're really happy to see the provincial government investing in some stimulus, like with the housing enabling infrastructure, because that's going to be really important for municipalities, for our municipalities in Waterloo region, but across the community or across the province, because as we found during the 2009 downturn, investing in infrastructure and giving it to communities like ours to spend, we can create local jobs. We can get that money into the hands of local businesses and people who are employing people pretty quickly.
On the other side of that, the province announced its plan to standardize development charges with the hopes of building more homes. How much of a difference is that going to make in Waterloo?
Well, that we're still digesting some of that new legislation, but as I said, I do think the $400 million extra that's going into the housing enabling water infrastructure, that will be really impactful. I know that we've got a lot of housing that is ready to move ahead, but we need the money to build that infrastructure, the roads, the sewers, the water waste and wastewater mains and things like that. If we can get access to that money quickly, and I recently did table a motion to ask the provincial and the federal governments to fast track any stimulus money, because the quicker we can get that into our communities, the quicker we can get some of these projects moving, primarily housing that has been stalled, the quicker we can keep people in our community working, keep people employed, and keep businesses, particularly developers, building.
All right. I appreciate you making time for us, Mayor.
Okay, thank you so much.
That is Dorothy McCabe. She is the mayor of Waterloo, one of the communities predicted to be most vulnerable to tariffs in this province. Now let's return to Brian Lewis. He is a senior fellow at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. He was also the chief economist for Ontario. Brian, we've been hearing from many stakeholders, this hour on the program, talking about what's being unveiled in this provincial budget. We talked a little bit about revenue being down. What are some of the other economic challenges that the province needs to contend with this budget?
Yeah, I think one of the big challenges is going to be just the overall degree of uncertainty. I think that's going to keep people from spending money. It's going to keep businesses from investing, and that has very detrimental effects on the economy. So everything the government can do to instill confidence that this is going to be a great place to do business, a great place to live and work is really important. And I think, the government's really emphasized that in a lot of conscious and maybe subconscious way in the budgets by basically saying, we've got a plan for the future, and we've got your backs if things are going to go sideways over the next little while. It came up in one of the other comments. I think we need to hear more about the federal government side, and while they're taking a lot of flack for not doing a budget, and I would be one of the people adding flack for that, let's hope that they don't stay on the sidelines in terms of talking about what some of those broad-based supports they might be providing for people, because we found during the pandemic the federal government can be a very effective arm for delivering immediate support to people because of the organizations it basically has, like CRA, who can get money to people quickly and things like that. What are some of those economic challenges going to mean for the job market? Yeah, the government's forecast based on private sector forecasts show really minimal employment growth this year and an edging up the unemployment rate. It will probably remain tough times for employment in the province, and if the trade environment gets worse, it could be very bad. We lost 32,700 manufacturing jobs last month, and let's hope that's not a sign of things to come, but early signs are some economic sectors are going to get affected, and I think giving confidence will be really important in finding some of those sectors that are affected. It makes a lot of sense to emphasize the manufacturing sector. They have the most directly at play in terms of trade in the United States. But, there's agricultural trade, there's mineral trade, there's financial services trade, and even some sectors that don't trade a lot, like construction, could be really heavily impacted. For example, if people aren't going to be investing as much here in factories and buildings for business, then that's going to affect the construction sector as well. So, I think we saw initial impacts on construction last month. I guess I'm saying it could spread a lot further over time if the trade situation isn't addressed in an effective and timely way.
All right. And I guess finally, how, these are a lot of big numbers, big spending, but on an individual basis, a household basis, how is this financial outlook, what is that going to mean for individuals and their spending habits? Yeah, the economic outlook is suggesting, inflation of around 2% per year. So we're back to the kind of expected to be at the annual kind of pace of growth in the cost of living that we're used to. So, I think we seem to be back to normal on that after a few years where there was, people were really feeling the pinch and were really struggling with affordability. Going forward, though, that's economy-wide averages, but, there's certainly some people who are and some people who will be hurting, those who have trouble finding jobs, some people who get laid off. We're finding really high unemployment rates among the youth population for now, and that could be really detrimental if it means people start moving away. So, they don't take up the trades that we want them to take up and things like that. So a lot of things to watch for here where even if the aggregate figures do okay, there could be some pockets of the economy that are really struggling. All right. Brian, thanks so much for that. That is Brian Lewis, Ontario's former chief economist. He's going to be back on the program later this hour. Now, if you're looking to buy a home for the first time, you're not alone. The province is trying yet again in this budget to increase the number of homes being built, something that it has struggled to do. Alex Beheshti is an urban planner and economist and senior researcher at the Missing Middle Initiative at the University of Ottawa. And Alex joins me now. Hello.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Now, the province is nowhere near its goal of building 1.5 million new homes by 2031. This budget is forecasting about 72,000 housing starts this year, slightly more next year. What do you make of those projections? How realistic are they? And what's that going to mean for that goal we have of 1.5 million?
Well, if you're someone who appreciates a stiff drink, then this budget has you covered. Lots of stuff in there for that. If you're a municipality, a home builder, or someone that's looking to buy or rent, then you may want that stiff drink to help take in some of that tough outlook. On the forecast side, the news is pretty grim. The province is expecting an 18% drop in starts compared to the forecast from Budget 2024, which Budget 2024 was also in and on itself a pretty grim budget. The province is forecasting 500 and just under 570,000 housing starts by 2028, which is about 435-ish thousand fewer than the million they need by 2028 to stay on track for their 1.5 million home goal by 2031. This means that, by 2029, 2030, and 2031, the final 3 years of that 2031 goal, we're going to need about 320,000 homes built in Ontario each of those years. And just for perspective, Canada in a good year builds 250,000 homes, so Ontario has to build even more than what Canada can build. So pretty tough outlook.
We were talking to the mayor of Waterloo, and she was looking for a bit more details on this next piece. There is a promise in the budget to standardize development charges, as well as $400 million in new spending for water systems and housing infrastructure. How is that going to help this housing picture in the overall picture?
I think the mayor of Waterloo put on a pretty friendly face about it, but this is a tough slog. 400 million additional dollars. They're spending about $1 billion in total on water infrastructure. I mean, $1 billion is what a small municipality will spend on water infrastructure, but you're talking about spreading this across the province. So how much can 400 million do? I mean, it's not nothing, but we're not talking about dollars that move the needle. In terms of standardizing development charges, what you're referring to is Bill 17. And, not to get into the sausage making, since that's its own kind of thing, but Bill 17 only brings the regulation making power. So there's a difference between law and regulation. The province still has a ton of consultations to do and to actually write the regulations, not to mention they still have to pass Bill 17. So in terms of standardizing development charges, I see absolutely no impact within 2025. I mean, the construction season is already supposed to be starting. So, by the time you get all of that kind of bureaucratic work done, we're into next year.
Now, Prime Minister Mark Carney wants to build homes too. How much collaboration, is there or is there need to be between the feds and the province on this?
They need to be walking hand in hand, and so Bill 17 does provide some help to the federal government. So it allows municipalities to lower and to freeze development charges without having to go through certain bureaucratic processes that the current system requires. That's an ask for Ottawa. Now, if Ottawa comes in with the money to get those reductions or those freezes, then there could be a lot of collaboration. Essentially, what Ontario did is said, we're going to get out of the way in terms of the framework that we own, but this allows for a one-to-one conversation between Ottawa and the specific municipality in question.
Alex, I appreciate you making time for us this hour.
Thanks for having me.
Alex Beheshti is urban planner and economist and senior researcher at the Missing Middle Initiative at the University of Ottawa. Let's bring back in my co-host, Mike Crawley. Mike, we heard what Alex had to say there about housing. The province has been attempting to increase housing starts for some time now. Why aren't they hitting those targets?
Well, that's a great question, Raj. I'm sure that Doug Ford and Peter Bethlenfalvy wish that they knew the answer. Look, the government's efforts to try to speed up the pace of housing construction has really been totally focused on getting municipalities to approve developments faster. So we just even had, as recently as Monday, the government bringing in new legislation that was, again, focused on speeding things up at the municipal approval level. And they've kept on doing this, and it isn't actually speeding much up. That's because demand, like the market for new housing, is kind of flat, and so developers they're putting the pause on projects, or they're downscaling projects, or that sort of thing. Some are even canceling them outright, and so that's what's happening. And what you end up seeing in the budget is a forecast that the government is the private sector is expecting that there will be fewer than 75,000 homes built this year and next year. And so you got to remember, do the math, 1.5 million homes in a decade, that's 150,000 new homes each year. They're not even at half that yet. And no real plan in here to do anything else to spur that housing development.
All right, Mike, we're going to come back to you in a bit. In a moment, we're going to talk about infrastructure, something the province is doubling down on given the tariff chaos. But first, let's go back to the budget lockup, where just a little while ago we heard what opposition leaders think. First, you're going to hear from NDP leader Mart Stiles, and then Liberal leader Bonnie Crombie and Green leader Mike Schreiner.
This is a Band-Aid budget. It is a missed opportunity to strengthen Ontario. The government could have built a tariff-proof future with good schools, affordable homes, world-class public health care, and reliable public services. Instead, the Ford government chose more cuts, less relief, and no real support for families who need help right now. People across Ontario have been asking, why weren't we in a stronger position to take on these tariffs and this attack from Donald Trump?
Today's budget is yet another painful reminder that Doug Ford doesn't govern for you. In fact, funding to healthcare and education has been flatlined. Frankly, I'm appalled for all Ontarians, for the young people who want affordable housing, for the families in this province who don't see anything to help with their groceries or their cost of living, for the parents who don't see any relief in the classrooms, and for the seniors who see decreased funding for healthcare.
I just want to say that this budget ignores the fact that people are going to be hurt by the tariff war, that we need a budget that actually invests in people. This budget talks a lot about cars and infrastructure, doesn't talk a lot about actually investing in people.
Opposition leaders Mart Stiles, NDP from the NDP, Bonnie Crombie of the Liberals, and Mike Schreiner of the Greens, speaking to reporters in the budget lockup earlier today. Now let's bring back in senior Queen's Park reporter Mike Crawley to get his take. Mike, you know, the PCs won a dominant majority. We know that from this previous election. So the opposition don't have a ton of sway here. What are they trying to accomplish here feasibly?
Yeah, Ramraj, I think that one of the most demoralizing things for a provincial politician must be, trying to spin the first budget after they've lost an election, because Doug Ford put his plan out towards the people of Ontario, and that's what they voted for. And this budget, in many ways, follows up on the plan that Ford put forward in the campaign. So I think if there was a theme, though, from the opposition leaders, it was that the tariff, they seemed to define the tariff responses as inadequate, that it wasn't really meeting the need of the moment. They're looking in particular also at the spending within those big ticket windows of healthcare and education. And so, I think I heard a little bit from each of the opposition leaders about their sort of pet things that they had during the campaign. Bonnie Crombie in particular talking about, in her news conference, mentioned several times emergency room waits and the lack of addressing of that. So, I think it gives us a bit of an indication of how the opposition parties are going to approach their criticism of the Ford government going forward.
All right. Thanks for that, Mike. You are listening to your Ontario Budget Special here on CBC Radio 1. I'm Ramraj Shavendran. That is my co-host, Mike Crawley. We are bringing you analysis this hour, province-wide, and we're also streaming on your smart TV, CBC Gem, and cbcnews.ca/Toronto. Now, this budget shows infrastructure remains a focus for this government, whether that's building more of it, like highways, public transit, and shipbuilding in the north, or removing it in the case of Toronto's bike lanes. The province is touting spending $33 billion on planned infrastructure investments like highways, public transit, and schools for this fiscal year alone. Shoshana Sachs is an associate professor of civil and mineral engineering at the University of Toronto and joins me now. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Now, in periods of economic turmoil, we often see governments spending a lot of money on building things. How much of that are you seeing in this budget?
We're seeing a lot of investment in infrastructure, but not really any different than what we would have seen last year. So it's not a particular investment taking into account the economic turmoil that we're currently seeing. And it's important to remember also that when we invest in infrastructure, we're trying to achieve two things. So one, you're trying to pump money into the economy through construction jobs, buying concrete, buying steel, but you're also trying to build things that will make the economy work better, that will make people's lives work better. And so we do see the government pushing out money, but not things that will have much efficacy, and certainly not much efficacy anytime soon.
And most of what was unveiled today has already had an announcement on it. Were there any infrastructure investments that caught your eye in this budget?
I think that the previously announced investment in critical materials is a good one. We want to keep being a supplier of resources for ourselves and for the world. And as the world increasingly pivots to being about electronics, about sustainability, we're going to need those critical materials. I think it's also really disappointing to see the province continue to focus so much on bike lanes. Right? Bike lanes make cities more affordable, they make congestion better. And so the province is pushing things that will waste money and make congestion worse while making people's lives more expensive, which is really too bad to see, especially given the economic context.
Now, Prime Minister Mark Carney asked the premiers to think big about some of these nation-building projects. Doug Ford, floated the Ring of Fire, the 401 tunnel, and a new deep-sea port in James Bay in his letter to the PM. What else should this province be considering? If you feel like, this isn't a huge difference from what we would have seen last year, what else, infrastructure-wise, would you like to see development on or spending on?
Yeah, I'd like to see the province and Canada as a whole think about things we can build fast that will be efficacious. So we want things that we can use now, next year, 6 months from now, not projects that will take 20 or 30 years. Right? The 401 tunnel, for example, is not opening before you and I retire, even if it ever does get built. So the province saying this is something we're doing to make Ontario better. It's a feasibility study that will take a couple years, cost millions of dollars. That's not a real thing that's going to impact anybody's lives during this economic cycle. But there are things that we could build that are rapid deployment. And if we were really serious about meeting the economic moment, we would be trying to try new things like rapid bus lanes, rolling out way more bike lanes. Or if you think back to the pandemic where we tried new things and we did them fast, that's the kind of response you want if you want to see impact on the order of months to years as opposed to decades.
All right. I appreciate your thoughts on this. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Shoshana Sachs is a Canada Research Chair in Sustainable Infrastructure. She is also an Associate Professor of Civil and Mineral Engineering at the University of Toronto. I'm Ramraj Shrivendran. You are listening to a province-wide special about the Ontario provincial budget. It is live right here on Radio 1, and we're also streaming on CBC Gem, cbcnews.ca/Toronto, and on your smart TV. My co-host this hour is Mike Crawley. We're bringing you analysis on the budget and speaking to stakeholders about what is coming out of the spending priorities of this government. And we also have Brian Lewis in studio with me. He's been following along in this conversation. Brian, when we're talking about some of the infrastructure pieces, what we did with Shoshana there, was there anything you feel like the government could have spent more on?
Yeah, for sure there is. First of all, infrastructure, and even it goes back to housing, where there was a good conversation about that, just a few minutes ago. Government's objectives in these areas are well-intentioned, but I'm concerned about our capacity to deliver more. We have been pushing as a public service and as a government and as people really hard on housing, pushing really hard on building. I'm not sure there's a lot of capacity to do anymore, and we should be realistic with ourselves about how to do that. And to build capacity to do that, the government's investing big in skilled trades, and that is good, but they won't invest in post-secondary education. And yet, whether it's Dennis's manufacturing firms, it'll need engineers and planners and people like that, or whether it's the building industry that will also need people with STEM backgrounds, and we need technology people. They come from our post-secondary education sector, which is a fundamental strength, but the government's recognizing it's going to be that sector is going to have less resources going forward, and I'm concerned about that crucial economic strength being eroded. That's something I worry about. In terms of a couple of other things that are not there, well, the Ford government's priorities are pretty consistent. Keep costs down, push on skilled trades and infrastructure. The only time climate change is mentioned in the entire budget is with respect to the government's sustainable bond financing program. some recognition that this is happening, some recognition that we have to do things differently in the face of it, and some recognition we should do something about the underlying problem would all be really refreshing. And they've never really made it a priority to do something about poverty. The word doesn't come up in the budget once. It's not something they've really embraced. They've done some things for disabled people and low-income seniors, but they really haven't embraced that as a priority. And it's the kind of thing that if we hit a serious economic downturn, we're going to have a big increase in the number of poor people out there. And I don't think as a society that's something that we're all comfortable with.
We talk a lot about balancing the budget. That was a priority for this government when they came into power the first time around. The PCs thought, last fall that they were on track to do so within a couple of years. That idea is thrown out the window because of the circumstances we're in right now. What do you make of the approach right now, considering the fact that, the economy's in the situation it's in? Are we going to see a balanced budget anytime soon? Is that a possibility?
It's always a possibility because there's such a broad range of risk around what could happen in the future. The government's tabled a reasonable plan. It's a pretty good chance a year from now things are going to look really different. Just think about how different this plan is from last year's budget or that one was from the year before. So they have a reasonable plan. A lot could happen. If there's more revenue that comes in, then there's a chance to balance the budget earlier. I'm concerned about just how hard it will be to deliver on this plan if things kind of come through as expected. There's a significant amount of expenditure restraint implied in this budget while expenses aren't being reduced. Growing healthcare expenditures by 1.6% per year over the next 3 years, given our growing population, given the growing cost of service delivery, and given that there's already a big gap in services, that seems like it's going to be really hard to square up. So, these numbers are going to be tough to meet, and I think it'll be interesting to see, how this holds up when it comes to a fall economic statement or even next year's budget. But to give them credit, they have a plan to balance the budget and they have a plan to do it within this mandate. So good on them for trying to retain an element of some fiscal discipline in an environment where some other provinces have clearly thrown that away to a much larger degree.
All right, Brian, I appreciate you joining us this hour.
Oh, great to be here.
Brian Lewis is a senior fellow at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. He's also a former chief economist for the province. And as we wrap up this province-wide special, I'm going to bring back in my co-host, Mike Crawley. Mike, there's been a lot to talk about with stakeholders. We've covered a lot of ground over the past hour, and we couldn't get to everything in this budget. So what else stood out for you that you wanted to bring up before we go?
Well, Ramraj, it wouldn't be a Doug Ford government budget if we didn't talk about booze, and that actually did stand out to me. The revenue forecasts for the LCBO are going down pretty significantly. Just this year alone, more than $300 million less revenue forecast for the LCBO. Also, the government's forecast for how much they're going to take in beer, wine, and spirits tax. So that's separate from the LCBO's profits. That's going down another $100 million or so. So you're talking close to $500 million less revenue from booze forecast to come in. The flip side of that is that some of those tax reductions are targeted towards the craft beer industry to make things better for them. And I got a note from the Ontario Craft Brewers Association, very pleased with that. But definitely a drop in what the government is expecting to take with revenue from alcohol.
Now, Mike, you've covered a lot of provincial budgets. How does this one stack up?
16 of them, in fact, Ramraj. I'm getting old. So this is my 16th budget I've covered. Look, I think what you see in this budget is a lot of packaging what the government normally does as a way of protecting Ontario's economy against tariffs. So you heard some discussion in there about infrastructure that it's not really much different from what they were planning to do anyway. It's still, building transit, building some hospitals, a little bit of a sped up timeline, a little bit more money being spent on those things over the 10-year period. But this isn't like an infrastructure action plan kind of budget. And much of it is just simply, well, we're going to build these things. Oh, and by the way, because it creates jobs, it's going to protect the economy against tariffs. So that's a bit of a sell there by Doug Ford's government.
I have about 30 seconds with you. The budget is presented. Where does the government go from here?
Yeah, so there's basically the legislative process here is that now that it's presented, there's a debate over the next couple of weeks. It will pass because Doug Ford's government has a majority. But an interesting part of the process is there's what's called the estimates. That's the more like detailed, line by line, what they're spending on this, that, and the other program. And I'm going to be wanting to look at that because you may see some programs squeezed in those fine numbers.
All right. Mike, thank you for breaking down all these numbers with us this hour. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome, Ramraj.
That is Mike Crawley, our senior Queen's Park reporter. And that's the end of our special provincial budget coverage here on CBC Radio 1. And we've been streaming on your smart TV and online. Now you can head over to our website, cbc.ca/Toronto. There's a ton of provincial budget coverage and analysis. So if there's anything you missed in this conversation, if you want something more in-depth that you didn't get captured in this hour, you can find it there. Again, the website is cbc.ca/Toronto. Thank you for joining us. And if you want to hear my voice again, I'll be back in the next hour after the world this hour with Here and Now. Otherwise, enjoy your local regional afternoon drive program. I'm Ramraj Sharvendran, and that's it for our budget special. Have a good afternoon.